And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jason Palich. I am the Executive Director of the 495 Metro West Partnership. Welcome to a special presentation of our Water Resources Committee. As you are likely aware, EPA Region 1 has announced that they will exercise their residual designation authority under the Clean Water Act in the Charles, Mystic, and Neponset River watersheds. This morning, we're going to hear from EPA Region 1 leadership about this process. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to our Water Resources Committee co-chairs. But first, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are muted during today's session. Following the presentation, we will invite you to ask questions of our presenter by typing them into either the Q&A function or the chat function of today's Zoom meeting. We will monitor the questions submitted and read them aloud to our presenter. Please note that, of course, questions which are redundant or disrespectful will not be asked. We also ask that you keep questions as succinct as possible. We do understand that this morning's subject matter is highly technical in nature, but please understand that due to time constraints, we will need to condense questions that are of excessive length. And a good rule of thumb is that a question is always closer to a sentence than to a paragraph. Our conversation this morning is scheduled to last for up to 1 hour. Should you experience any technical difficulties during the session, our immediate guidance is to log out and then try logging back in. Should you need further assistance, the partnership's Deputy Director of Policy and Planning, Jeremy Thompson, is available to assist you and can be reached via email at jeremy@495partnership.org. Please note also that today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the partnership's YouTube page later today. We typically begin 495 Metro West Partnership events with attendees introducing themselves. At this time, we invite you to utilize the chat function to introduce yourself with your name, title, and organization so folks can get a sense of who is with us this morning. I'd also like to thank the co-chairs of our Water Resources Committee. We have 3 co-chairs of our Water Resources Committee representing the private sector. We have Dan Feeney of Beals & Thomas, who will moderate the Q&A portion of our program later this morning. Our public sector co-chair, Robert Cantareggi, who is the DPW director for the town of Franklin, and our environmental co-chair, Allison Field-Juma, who's the executive director for ORS, which is the organization for the Assabet, Sudbury, and Concord rivers. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Allison Field-Juma, who will introduce our presenter this morning. And go ahead, Allison, take it away.
Thank you, Jason. So I'd like to start my introduction with a little background. As Jason noted, EPA's Region 1 has announced that they'll exercise their residual designation authority, or RDA, under the Clean Water Act in 3 eastern Massachusetts watersheds, the Charles, the Mystic, and the Neponset. This will require the owners of certain commercial, industrial, and institutional properties with 1 or more acres of impervious area to obtain coverage for their stormwater discharges through a Clean Water Act permit. Once permits are issued, property owners will be required to take steps to reduce pollutants in their stormwater. EPA anticipates issuing 1 or more general permits specifying the activities that property owners must implement to reduce stormwater pollution from their properties. So before these requirements are finalized, EPA will conduct a public process, including publication of draft permits and an opportunity to comment. Privately owned commercial, industrial, and institutional properties with 1 acre or more impervious cover will need to seek coverage under one of these general permits or an individual permit if they prefer, and take the actions spelled out in the permit. So this will apply to 495 Metro West Partnership communities that are fully or partially located within the Charles River watershed. These are Ashland, Bellingham, Franklin, Holliston, Hopedale, Hopkinton, Medfield, Medway, Milford, Millis, Natick, Norfolk, Sherborne, Wayland, and Wrentham. It will also apply to portions of Foxborough and Medfield, which are located in the Neponset River watershed. The 495 Metro West Partnership's Water Resources Committee is pleased to host EPA Region 1 staff this morning for an informational presentation, which will be followed by a question and answer period where you can engage with them. The purpose of this morning's forum is largely informational. It's to update and inform stakeholders about the process. The partnership's Water Resources Committee will convene a follow-up discussion to discuss the wishes, concerns, and hopes of our various stakeholders as the partnership weighs how to approach the topic going forward. This discussion, will take place on Tuesday morning, December 13th at 8:30 a.m. It will be a hybrid event, both virtual and in-person participation is welcome. Event details and registration information will go out over the coming weeks. Be sure you're signed up for the partnership's email updates so that you can get these details. So now the presentation. Joining us this morning, we're very pleased to have Ken Morath, the Director of the Water Division of the New England Region 1 Office of the EPA here in Boston. Ken is trained in law and has been working on water issues for the past 30 years. With that, I'll turn it over to Ken.
Thanks, Allison. It's really great to be here. I love finding people who are interested in stormwater as a topic. There's nothing I'd rather talk about. So let me start. I will go through a presentation and then happy to answer questions and have discussion. So let's see if the screen share will work. Can somebody tell me that they see that?
Looks good, Ken.
Great. Okay. All right. So this is labeled Charles River Stormwater Permitting. And what you're going to be seeing, I drew these slides from a presentation that I gave to the 495 partnership a couple of years ago when we were first starting to think about this, and we were doing some early outreach to stakeholders to try to get people's views on how to respond on this issue. So you'll see a lot about the Charles River here, and I know for your membership, that's probably the most relevant, but it's not the only watershed, as Allison mentioned. The Neponset, as well as the Mystic River watersheds, are included now in this effort. But we haven't yet updated our presentation to include them all because we're not yet at that point. But that's why you'll see a lot here about the Charles. But again, that is the most relevant, I think, for most of your membership. So what we're talking about with the Charles is a watershed with 35 communities. It's an 80-mile long river, 310 square miles. It's a large watershed, and again, now we're adding the Neponset and the Mystic, so this program is going to cover most of Greater Boston. The Charles, and this is true of the other rivers as well, they're heavily used, but Charles in particular for combinations of boating. You see swimmers there. There's a lot of hope that the river can be restored for swimming, and it's actually most days pretty close to that point now. And we're really hoping this effort will push us over the finish line in terms of really achieving our water quality goals in these rivers. So just backing up for a minute, historically, there's been several decades now of work in Greater Boston under the Clean Water Act, the centerpiece being the Boston Harbor cleanup, which had a huge impact on the harbor, obviously, but also on the rivers, because a big part of that Boston Harbor cleanup involved getting more of the sewage from the 43 member communities of the MWRA, getting that sewage to Deer Island to be treated and greatly reducing the amount that spilled over into local rivers and streams. So the Boston Harbor cleanup had a big impact on the rivers. But now what's left is stormwater. That's 20 or 30 years ago, if you were looking at the problems in these rivers, a lot of it would have been raw sewage overflows. Now that's a greatly reduced problem as a result of the billions of dollars of investment on Deer Island in wastewater treatment. But stormwater now is left as the remaining problem. And as EPA each year, in partnership with the watershed associations, we issue report cards on the rivers, and we've seen really dramatic and steady improvements. But in recent years, we've seen more of a leveling off as stormwater problem remains and really needs to be addressed. And that's basically what this slide is showing you. That's a photograph of the Charles River, believe it or not. That's, there are some pretty severe algae blooms in the river in the summers. And some of them can be toxic. They're all ugly and they interfere with recreation. But some of them are actually quite toxic. And so it's a really important priority for both Massachusetts and EPA to really address these issues. And when we look at the cause, of these problems, it's really phosphorus. Excess phosphorus is the problem. And phosphorus is a nutrient that stimulates algae blooms when it's in the water. You use it in your garden as a fertilizer. It's a fertilizer in the water too. And you don't want more fertilizer in the water because you get algae blooms like this. And when we look at the sources of phosphorus, it's almost entirely now stormwater runoff. So this slide basically makes that point. That big blue chunk in that left-hand pie chart is the share of phosphorus that comes from stormwater. So phosphorus is the problem that causes these algae blooms. To reduce phosphorus, we really need to tackle stormwater. And the pie chart on the right shows you that most of that stormwater, the red chunk that looks like Pac-Man, comes from stormwater runoff from impervious areas, from all of our paved surfaces, our streets and sidewalks, parking lots, our rooftops. There's a small amount, 25% comes from vegetated areas, but most of it comes from impervious areas. So that's really the focus of what we need to do. So we've done some very detailed and thorough analysis of exactly where the phosphorus is coming from. Breaking it down by land use, and you don't need to focus on any particular number here, just this is intended to convey the overall sense that in order to achieve the phosphorus reduction that we need to restore these rivers to health, we need to get roughly 65% phosphorus reduction. This is in the Charles. It'll be a different number in each river, depending on the characteristics of the river. And bacteria is also a focus of this effort, but I'm just using phosphorus as an illustration. And that's it's probably the dominant issue on the Charles now. So we need pretty big reductions, is the point of this slide, on the order of about 2/3 from most of our land uses. So how do you reduce phosphorus? And I know a lot of you know this as well as I do, or even better. I know some of you, this is your business, but for those who aren't as familiar, the kinds of things you do to reduce phosphorus from paved areas is you try to effectively disconnect the impervious cover from the river. And you do that by various practices that get the stormwater into the ground rather than into pipes that go to the river. So things like rain gardens, and you can see here, they can be very small. So you have a number of these scattered around, but they don't need to be really big to be effective. And in fact, as we're doing a lot of research on this to try to figure out the most cost-effective ways to control stormwater, and we're finding more and more that having many small areas can be really effective. So things like small-scale rain gardens, things as simple as in a parking lot, if you have raised vegetated areas, when you repave the parking lot, lower those areas so that the water can go into them and seep into the ground. Things like rain barrels, green roofs where that's practical. There's a green roof on EPA's building, which works really well. And then there are also some non-structural practices that can also really help, like doing a really good job removing leaf litter in the fall. Organic material is a big source of phosphorus. Good sweeping practices. So those are some of the control strategies. And that's what this will all mean in practice. When this permit goes out and goes into effect, what you'll actually see out in the world is a lot of these practices being implemented. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've done already to deal with phosphorus and stormwater, because this is really important context for the action that we're taking now. So we started probably a decade ago working on permits for municipalities that were going to address municipal stormwater discharges. And EPA issued a permit that requires all of the communities in the Charles River watershed, except for Boston. Boston gets its own permit, and we're working on that now. But 34 other communities are all covered by a general permit that governs all of them. That permit took effect in 2018, and that permit gives each of the Charles River communities a phosphorus reduction target that it needs to meet. And it's roughly in line with the numbers that you saw earlier. Some big reductions in phosphorus, and they differ from community to community, but they average more than half. They have to reduce phosphorus by more than half. So the communities are all developing their plans for how they're going to implement the kind of practices that I showed you to reduce phosphorus. So that's a pretty heavy lift for the communities. It's going to take a lot of resources. Fortunately, this is a great time if you're a municipality to be implementing clean water control projects, because there's a lot of funding available as a result of the infrastructure bills that have passed in the last year or so. There's just a flood of money going into each of our states, into the revolving loan fund program. A lot of it will be issued in the form of, it'll be equivalent to grants, because there'll be a lot of loan forgiveness available. So this is a great time for communities to be investing in stormwater control, but they do have a lot of work to do. So as we looked at the phosphorus issue overall, what we see is the municipalities are making a big investment in reducing phosphorus and stormwater. They have already, over the last couple of decades, made big investments in their wastewater treatment plants to reduce phosphorus. And what's left is the phosphorus from the private sector. And that's the lead into the action that we announced in September and that I'm here to talk about. So we are not the only ones to be looking at the phosphorus picture and thinking we've got the municipalities really working and investing on this issue. What's left is the private sector. The environmental groups have also seen that, and we have received petitions from Conservation Law Foundation and the Charles River Watershed Association to use our authority to require stormwater permits for facilities in the private sector. And this is that the authority to do that is called residual designation. It's a provision in the Clean Water Act that allows EPA to require stormwater permits for facilities or for sectors that are contributing to water quality problems. I'm going to use shorthand. I'm not going to go into all the legal details about this, but that's basically what it is. It's if you have a group of facilities that are contributing to a water quality problem, EPA can require permits and people can petition EPA to do that. So we received petitions from the environmental groups in 2019 and 2020 for the three rivers. And when we received them, we did a round of conversations with stakeholders, including 495 Partnership, NIOP, a number of other groups, to try to get people's thoughts about how we should be looking at those petitions. And we kind of took all that into account, spent a couple of years analyzing data. We pulled together data for all the properties in the Charles River watershed, by size, by sector, estimated phosphorus loads in all different ways, and thought about what kind of permitting program might make sense to really address this problem. So this is just more details about the whole residual designation process. I'll skip over that. Petitions we've talked about. So when we review these petitions, we have to make a decision whether or not to grant them. And if we grant them, we can grant them as they're written. We could grant them partially. We have to use our judgment about what really makes sense. And one thing we've really focused on in our thinking is the connection, is the big picture, is what the municipalities already are on the hook to do and what additional work is needed in order to meet the water quality goals, and how those two efforts could fit together, how to make sure that what the municipalities do and what the private sector do can work together and make sense together as a way to solve this problem. We thought a lot about what types of facilities make sense to include, what the size threshold should be. We got a lot of input from the stakeholders we talked to on those issues. We've thought about, we're starting to think about schedules, what might be a realistic schedule for people to implement the requirements once the permits are issued. And so here's just a kind of a recap of the engagement that we did in September 2020. We started our outreach efforts. We had a number of conversations in the fall of 2020. And starting in 2021, we were doing our own analysis and thinking the issues through based on the input that we got. And I've already covered this. So that's all the lead into the action that we took in September. And in September, we announced that we would be moving forward to do a residual designation in the 3 watersheds that we received petitions for, the Charles, Mystic, and Neponset, and that our intent was to cover facilities with 1 acre of impervious cover or more. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people. So we announced that we would do for these 3 watersheds 1 acre or more of impervious cover for commercial, industrial, and institutional facilities. The petitions also asked us to cover residential facilities with 1 acre or more in size. So I'll talk about 2 main differences between what the petitions asked us to do and what we did. And one is the petitions asked us to include residential, and for now we are holding off on that. And we're certainly interested in people's comments on whether we should include residential in the future, and that's something we will consider. But for now, we decided to move forward first with commercial, industrial, and institutional facilities. And the second difference is that the petitions asked us to include all facilities with property sizes 1 acre or greater, and we decided not to base it on property size, but instead to base it on the amount of impervious cover. And we're doing impervious cover of 1 acre or greater rather than parcel size 1 acre or greater. So obviously that's a smaller number of facilities. But we do think we capture a significant percentage of the phosphorus. We're not losing that much phosphorus control by going to 1 acre, but it does significantly reduce the number of facilities. And we're trying to balance not imposing requirements on too many small facilities, but still get enough phosphorus reductions to meet the water quality goals. So that's one of the things that I'm sure people will comment on when this permit goes out. So I guess the last thing I want to do is talk about the process, because this is really important to understand as we go forward. So when we are now working on drafting permits, and that's where all the decisions about, well, exactly what's going to be required, what will facilities have to do, how much time will they have to do it, how will we phase this in, how do we make this practical for people to actually comply with, what are going to be the costs, and how can we write the permits in a way that minimizes the costs but also achieves the water quality goals. So those are all the things we're going to be wrestling with as we draft the permits. And built into the process is a lot of public engagement. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today. It's why we came in 2020. We'll be back. The permit process includes a formal comment period. We don't just issue a permit, we issue a draft permit and we request comments, and we look at each of the comments. We take them really seriously. We make, in almost every permit, we make changes, sometimes significant changes based on the comments. They're really important to us. That's why we do a draft permit, is because we want the benefit of people's expertise and viewpoints. So we'll really be looking for that before we issue it in draft. To start the formal public comment period, we will do more outreach to the key stakeholders. So we're not at that point yet, so we haven't quite designed what that process will look like, but you'll hear from us again before we issue a draft, kicking off that formal public process. But this is all to say, one of the reasons to focus on these issues now is so that you'll be prepared and thinking about what are the things you really want to look at in the draft permit and be ready to comment on things. And I would imagine if you're an owner or a consultant to an owner or someone who's managing these types of facilities, you'd really want to look at exactly what am I required to do? What are the targets? What are my options for meeting the targets? How much time do I have to do it? How much flexibility do I have in choosing how to meet the targets? Those are all things that we really would welcome comments on. We really want the expertise of people who manage the properties to inform the process so that when the final permit is issued, it's a permit that is implementable, that is practical to implement, that's as cost effective as possible, because we really want this program to work and be sustainable. So I'm going to stop there. I see from the chat there are many questions. I don't see the questions themselves, but I see there's a large number of them. So I'm going to stop talking and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Ken. And in just a second, I'm going to ask Dan Feeney, our private sector co-chair, to go through some of the questions. And just a logistical reminder for folks, you can submit questions either in the chat or in the Q&A function, and Dan's going to read them aloud. But before we do so, I want to take a little bit of a minute just to editorialize here on behalf of the 495 Metro West Partnership. We pride ourselves on being a convener of stakeholders and a convener of important conversations across stakeholder groups. And I do want to emphasize something that Ken just mentioned, which is that EPA does have a process here to receive and consider stakeholder feedback. What we don't want to see here at the partnership is to have our stakeholders at the end of this process be shocked or surprised by it and feel like it wasn't something that they had a chance to be a part of. EPA is ready to receive your comments, and we do want to make sure that we as an organization are offering you the chance to do that. So without further ado, just to encourage everyone to let loose and have at it, I will turn things over to Dan to start going through the questions that we have.
Great. Thanks, Ken, for the presentation. Very informative. I know everyone's anxious to hear more, so we'll get to the questions. Can you discuss how the 1 acre threshold was chosen as opposed to, other thresholds, maybe 2 acres that might have been proposed in the past?
Sure. We basically, so I talked about, we did a lot of slicing and dicing of data. So there were some very extensive studies done that said, here's the phosphorus number that we need to get down to if we're going to avoid having these algae blooms. So we have a number we need to get to. The municipalities are going to bring us down some. And then we looked at what's the gap, how much more do we need? And we looked at, if you set it at 5 acres, how much would you get? If you set it at 3 acres, how much would you get? And so, you get more and more the more properties you bring into it. If you went down to half an acre, you'd get even more. But there's a certain point where the number of facilities is going up really fast, and the amount of extra phosphorus you're getting is not increasing that quickly. So 1 acre to us looked like the right spots. But again, that's something we will take comment on. I think that the 2 acre reference, I think, is to a proposal from 2009, 10, that time period where we had initially planned to go out with a pilot program. And we had looked at doing that for parcels with 2 acres of impervious cover, but just in the 3 towns of Milford, Bellingham, and Franklin. And some of the very strong feedback we got at that point was, it's a bad idea to pilot this in 3 towns because you're going to really impact business in those 3 communities. If you're going to do it, you should do it for the whole watershed. So we are doing it for the whole watershed. And in fact, we're doing it for 3 watersheds. So we're really covering the metro area. But at this point, it's not a pilot. This is not what we had proposed before, was kind of a toe in the water approach. Let's try this with a small group and see how it works. Now, at this point, we have petitions that sort of, they put the question squarely in front of us. How are you going to solve this problem? And so what we're proposing is actually the full program that will address the water quality problem.
Great. Another question, sort of in the similar light, is has the EPA looked at the phosphorus loading rates between parking and structures and how that plays into the 1 acre? Certainly there's certain properties that have more building and certain properties that have more parking, so.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, that's one of the things that, so when we put out the draft permit, we'll put out all of our analysis that supports what we're doing, including, you know, what we think the loading rates are from different types of properties and what the data is that supports that. And that's an area where, again, we would invite comments. And if people could comment, you know, well, I have a type of property that I think has less phosphorus loading than others in my sector, and here are the reasons. And that's the kind of information that would be really useful to us.
And we had another question about how will property owners be alerted to the fact that they may be subject to this permit requirements, you know, being 1 acre in one of the watersheds, 1 acre of impervious in one of the watersheds?
Yeah, so we have an obligation under our regulations to notify people that they need a permit. So this whole Clean Water Act provision is called the residual designation provision. So that the designation would include a notification. So when this all goes final, you know, so we'll do our best to publicize. We're about to issue the draft. We're issuing the draft. Please comment on it. We'll do our best to kind of publicize it broadly, but we'll also need to notify people that they're subject to it.
And does the EPA have a timeline of when they expect draft permits to be available for review and comment?
We don't really have a timeline yet, and so part of we are staffing up to do this. We need to have additional people on board to help us. Right, we're working on it now, but bring in some more people, both to develop the permits and to implement. We want to make sure we have the capacity when people call us with questions or need some guidance in how to do this, that we have qualified people available to help. So it's not imminent, but it's also a really high priority project. So it's, you know, it's probably not within the next 6 months, but might see it not too much longer than that, maybe 10 or 12 months, something like that. But at this point, because we're hiring up, it's hard to give an exact timeline.
Okay. Another question, this one's probably a specific example, but if there's a property that has more than 1 acre of impervious and they get coverage under the permit, but then there's site modifications to get under 1 acre of impervious, would they still be subject to the permit requirements?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that issue. That's a really great question. And that's, you know, that's something we might want to encourage. And so it could be a good idea to have a way to, I'm writing that down, and we'll think about that as we develop the permit. That's a really interesting concept.
Another question that's come in is the timeline for the private landowners to come into compliance with the permit. You know, a relative timeline to be able to do the design, permitting, construction that'd be necessary to retrofit a site.
Yep, that's a really key issue. So we have not yet developed those timelines, and I guess I'll say two things about it. One is you could look at the municipal permits, the MS4 permits, and for people who are not in this business, MS4 stands for municipal separate stormwater systems, and then there's a fourth S. I don't know what MS4 is. We just call it MS4, but it's municipal and then 4 S's. So it's the municipal stormwater permit. So they as I mentioned,
municipal separate storm sewer system. We know it well here at the partnership.
Thank you very much. So those permits, as I said, have some very significant phosphorus reduction requirements. The municipalities have I think it's 15 years to implement in phases. They have to get a certain amount done in each 5-year block. So that's to say that we recognize this can be a longer term issue to deal with effectively and cost effectively. One of the reasons for a phase, I guess there are a couple of reasons for a phase schedule. One is some of the feedback we heard that really made sense to us when we were talking about this issue with stakeholders was, if you let me do this when I'm repaving my parking lot anyways, it's a lot cheaper. So that's the kind of thing we want to consider is, and you may all have other comments along those lines with things about the way properties are managed that if we could help us figure out what's a reasonable schedule to get this work done. So that's one reason. Another is that for a municipality to deal with many projects like this on, across the municipality, their conservation commissions and building departments and so on, all the municipal agencies that have a role in the process of getting these done. We recognize that we need to have a way to do them at a reasonable pace and not have a big bottleneck. And there's limited contracting and consulting support available and we hope that will expand as this program really gets underway. But we want to make sure that this can be implemented. We do have a sense of urgency because we see real problems in the rivers, but at the same, so we want to do it as quickly as we can, but also at a pace that's reasonable from the point of view of someone who has to operate the facilities, and reasonable from the point of view of the municipality with its capacity to manage all these projects. So I'm not giving you a specific timeline with number of years and so on. That'll be developed as we develop the draft, and I'm sure we'll get lots of comment on that. But that's the overall philosophy is, we don't want to take more time than is necessary, but we want to allow as much time as is needed to do this in a cost-effective way.
Very good. We had a question regarding industrial facilities that are subject to a multi-sector general permit, and whether they would also be required to seek coverage under this residual designation.
I think we may have talked about that in the designation itself, and I don't remember exactly. I don't want to give you the wrong answer, so I'm not sure. I think we may have said you don't have to get 2 permits for the same discharge. You could have an industrial facility that maybe some portions of its discharge are covered by the MSGP, but others are not. And if you have an acre of impervious, you might be covered by 2 permits if you have 2 different types of discharges. But I'm not 100% sure. So that answer is really a guess.
Yeah,
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I don't know whether the multi-sector general permit, would address phosphorus removal and things like that. So it could be,
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look at that.
Okay.
And maybe we can have that questioner, if you want to go ahead and shoot that question to me at jason@495partnership.org, I'll go ahead and shoot that over to Ken to get you a follow-up answer there. And Dan, if you don't mind, I'd actually like to throw in with a question myself, if I can jump in here.
Go ahead.
And just to remind folks that questioning is still open if you want to submit further questions in either the chat or the Q&A. But Ken, I'm going to take the host prerogative to throw a nice loaded question at you. Other watersheds. I know that when we had these conversations about the pilot program about a decade in the past, it was very much, about the Charles River watershed being an early adopter. I'm wondering if you can comment on similar processes and other watersheds in other parts of the country who may be involved in a similar process, where they might be in the process. Is anybody further along than the Charles and Neponset and Mystic are in this process that you might be able to tell us about?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. One is, so there is in New England, there have been this mechanism has been used before. In Long Creek in Maine, on a much smaller scale, there are 100 facilities there, and here we're talking about probably thousands of facilities. But Long Creek is where the main mall is, just outside Portland. And so it's a kind of a similar configuration to a lot of things you'd find in the Boston metro area, a very densely developed area that was really impacting the creek. And so EPA did a designation. In that case, Maine issued the permit, state of Maine, because they have the authority to issue permits that we do in Massachusetts. And so those facilities have been working for the last 10 plus years to implement the kinds of stormwater projects that I talked about. Vermont has done this to reduce phosphorus in Lake Champlain. So there's some experience in New England. It's EPA announced maybe a couple of months before we announced this one in Boston. We announced that we were doing one in Los Angeles. It doesn't cover the whole metro area. I think this is really the first one that covers an entire metropolitan area, but some chunks of Los Angeles are being covered with a similar program. And there are petitions in other parts of the country that are also being looked at. So I think this is a real trend now that municipalities over the last 5 or 10 years have really have been getting permits that really push them to do as much as they can. The attention is starting to shift towards the private sector to say, how do we fill that? How do we go that last step and get rid of those remaining pollutants?
Thank you.
Great. We had another question that came in. Is each watershed going to have their own permit, or is there going to be one that applies to the Charles, Mystic, and Neponset?
So we're looking at that now. I would love to have one permit just for simplicity's sake. And if you're a consultant working with people in different watersheds, having one set of requirements that, it's just a lot simpler for us and for everybody else. But we won't know that until we complete the analysis on the other two watersheds. We're replicating what we did in the Charles and the other two watersheds, just to have the same kind of understanding of how much of a load comes from different types of properties and what the targets need to be. So if it looks too different in the other watersheds, that may drive us towards needing a separate permit. But I think my strong preference is, if we can, to have one permit, just to keep it simple. And maybe if we need to have maybe some different requirements that apply to different watersheds within that permit, we could do that. But we need to really look at the data first to make sure that that's a workable approach.
Okay. Another question that came in is it anticipated that in order to verify compliance that there'll be stormwater sampling and reporting required, or is it going to be based on design considerations?
Well, so that'll be one of the issues for the permit, as we develop the draft and for people to comment on. But I'd point again to the municipal permits just to give a sense of what our general approach is and what our philosophy is. In general, I think stormwater monitoring is really difficult because the storms are so variable, and it's hard to, what's in the outfall could vary at different points in the storm and from one storm to another. So in general, we think it's better to invest in the actual controls than to invest in a lot of monitoring. So with the municipal permits, our approach was to describe the different practices, to kind of create a menu of practices that you could choose from, and then a credit that you get for each practice, rather than to say, here's your number, meet this number and monitor to show that you're meeting it. So that was the approach we took there, and I think that's our general thinking. So that's the starting point for how we'll think about this permit.
Right. Does anyone have any other questions they want to fire into the chat? Last call for questions.
Hey, good morning. This is Bruce. Hey, Kenny, how are you?
How you doing?
Actually, it's kind of funny. I'm up in Long Creek right now, up in Maine. I'm speaking at the Cumberland County Maine Stormwater Conference.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I knew you would have a question.
No, it's deja vu for me and you, and I have a better feeling about the this RDA than the last time. I just want to put it out there, and you know, you did listen last time about doing the whole watershed, and this is all obviously a lot more encompassing just than the Charles. So economically, the burden on the businesses is less, particularly how it affects Franklin. So that's good. The one thing I did have you done, I know you have the data on the Charles River, but have you looked at how many properties on the Neponset and the Mystic it's going to affect?
That's part of the analysis that we're doing now.
Okay. Well, that's it. Good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you.
Well, with that, and I'm going to give Ken one final question, then we'll proceed to wrap up and sort of next steps from here. So Ken, I know you've talked about this already, but I'm going to impress upon you just to reiterate for our stakeholders and our viewers today, your anticipation both for your timeline and your process. Again, the partnership really wants to emphasize, we don't want to see stakeholders surprised at the end of this process and feel like they weren't a part of it. There are opportunities for folks to be a part of it. So if you could just reiterate both your timeline to the extent that you can anticipate it, as well as your process.
Yeah, so timeline, I guess kind of very roughly and vaguely, maybe something approaching a year, but that's really not pinned down yet. So really the point is it's not in the next few months, but it's not 3 years away. We're working on it. And then we will do some more outreach before that permit comes out in draft. And then once it does come out in draft, it will be open for comments, and at that point, we take written comments, and we'll look carefully at each one, and we really do value those comments, and they do have a big impact on the permit. We're looking for your expertise in terms of what it means to implement this permit, and that should help us shape a permit that's really as effective as it can be. So that's the goal. That's why we have a comment process. We really do want people to participate, because the worst thing in the world is if after that's all over and the permit is final, and then you look at it and say, oh, well, if this had only been written this other way, it would be so much easier to implement, and then it's too late. Those are the kinds of things we really want to hear during the process, so that we can make whatever changes are needed to make this the best permit it could be.
Well, thank you, Ken. And just a few comments to wrap up for our stakeholders. I want to, again, extend my thanks to Ken and EPA Region 1 staff for participating today. I do want to make a point of noting that, obviously a lot of government processes always have built-in comment periods, and sometimes they can seem perfunctory, but I want to make a point of noting that I found EPA Region 1 staff to be extremely responsive. I want to say within probably a few minutes of the RDA announcement coming out, I was badgering Ken to set a date to come present to us, and I think we had that on the calendar within a couple of hours. So for folks who are interested in reaching out to EPA Region 1 staff directly to have further conversation, outside of their public comment process, please feel free to reach out to the 495 Metro West Partnership. Again, we found their staff to be very responsive and engaging. I want to thank the leadership of our Water Resources Committee for their time today. That's Dan Feeney from Beals and Thomas for moderating, Allison Field-Juma from ORS, as well as Brutus Cantareggi from the town of Franklin for their leadership. And there is going to be a next step for the partnership's Water Resources Committee. The purpose of this morning's presentation was largely informational and technical in nature, give folks a sense of the RDA process, what's going on, get their technical questions answered. We are creating an opportunity for stakeholders to air their views on this topic, so we can start considering it as an organization, the feedback that we are going to offer. As Allison mentioned at the top of our presentation, that discussion is going to take place on Tuesday morning, December 13th at 8:30 a.m. There will be both an in-person and a virtual component to that. It will be a hybrid event for those folks who want to gather in person. We'll do so probably at our facility here in Westboro, but there will be a virtual opportunity as well. If you're not already on the Partnership's email list, be sure to visit 495partnership.org to sign up. And with that, I want to thank everyone for their presentation, for their participation this morning. And we look forward to engaging with you on this topic in the future. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.